Welcome to the Lobster Talks Podcast by Lobster Capital, where we celebrate the bold thinkers and innovators driving change in the startup world. I'm your host, Gabriel Jerrison, and today we have a guest who's blending art and technology and AI in a fascinating way. Madeleine D'Angelo, you're the co-founder of Arthena, a company that's using data and ML to revolutionize how we understand, value, and invest in art. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
I'm very excited as well. Art is, I guess, probably too often forgotten in the tech world. So I'm glad you're bringing back art into our minds. And my brother is an artist. So he's not listening to this, but hello, brother. Anyway, so I have a unique interest as well. To start, and we have so many things to cover, and it's going to be short because you have a call right after. So you're so busy. I thank you so much for being here. Just start off by introducing yourself, please, and then we'll dive in.
So hi, I'm Madeleine D'Angelo, the co-founder of Arthena, and our goal was to bring quantitative reasoning and pricing to the art market, which probably sounds like an oxymoron. And basically the thought was, in doing that, you're adding an objective price and data that allows more people to have clarity and then enter the market. So if you can objectively price these assets and use quantitative methodologies, ML, AI, the two sides of the same coin for some of the processes that we use, you can provide data that other people are used to seeing and speak in a language that other people are used to hearing. Whereas the art market can sound like a completely foreign language. It sounds like you're speaking, what's that expression? It's all Greek to me. It sounds like you're speaking something totally different. And then by using the universal language of math, we can make people feel comfortable and be able to participate, whether that's a large insurance company, a large financial institution, or an individual collector.
That's pretty robust and interesting theme. Very exciting. It's probably going to be on the title or cover of the pod or whatever, but you've been acquired by Masterworks. So let's just, say it right away. Congratulations. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
We'll go back to that. But before the acquisition and the exit, let's start with the founder's journey. How did you come up with that? What's the idea of let's put math and AI for arts? Because it makes perfect sense. But, what's the story there?
Oh, God. I mean, it really starts with when I was in graduate school and I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I had 5 male roommates and they were all at MIT. And a couple of them were working on a startup at a media lab. And that was back in 2009. And at that point, I was like, okay, I want to do something in tech. That was that kind of aha moment of, this is really interesting. I want to be able to participate in this. But unfortunately, my background was in history of art. And so it took me a couple of years to figure out, how do we bring these two fields together? And I had initially started off as a Jobs Act-based platform. So starting off with human expertise, creating fund strategies and structures, and then very much like Masterworks is doing today, then segmenting those out and then allowing for individuals to invest in those structures. And if anyone remembers AngelList syndicates, it was essentially of the same vein. And I was working with Thomas Corte at the time, and he was very good friends with Naval. And so we were kind of all like, this makes sense. Let's try this out. Turns out people in the art world don't want to go publicly online and share their secrets and their deal flow, unlike with tech, where I feel like it's a very open community. Where I think it's because they're serial entrepreneurs, right? A lot of investors were entrepreneurs like yourself. And so you want to welcome that community. The art market's very different. And so when we were realizing that we couldn't rely on human expertise, we started to think about we're doing all these interesting things with data in terms of trying to capture this market and capture this human expertise. So what's the next level? And at the end of that, we ended up with a really crazy quantitative structure for pricing these assets, and not a lot of people investing in the funds that were expert-led, and not a lot of experts enjoying that process. And so we went back to our investor at Foundation Capital, was our main investor at the time, and said, hey, we've built this really interesting quantitative platform that we didn't really expect to when we told you we were building a double-sided marketplace. What do you think we should do? And basically they were like, you should apply to YC and really go and think about how you should change your company and what the evolution of your company should look like now that you're essentially a quant shop for art. And so we applied and got in and was lucky enough to be part of the winter 2017 batch. And that really changed everything for us, just in terms of having that time to think about, what do we do with this really interesting thing that we've built that we didn't expect to build? And how do we use this? What's the use case?
Wow, crazy. The rest is history. I mean, it's the way and it's because you're being very modest, you make it sound like it's almost by accident, but obviously building a quant model for art doesn't happen randomly or by mistake. And so You said YC changed everything. I want to bring someone else. He's here on the pod, Sam Altman. No, that's not true. He's not here. But that would be fun.
That would be amazing.
Maybe you try to get him as well, right? So, but I think you told me, I believe that Sam was your group partner. He's apparently a very avid art collector. And so tell us the story. What did YC change? How did YC change everything for you?
It really gave us time completely separate from being involved in the New York City startup scene, which is, I think, very different, right? You know, as a foundation capital-backed startup that had raised a couple $1 million and had a team, I'd go to some of my friends that I graduated with or in finance, and they'd be like, good for you. That's so nice, right? And like, they think what you're doing is quaint or cute. And then, you know, you go out to the Bay Area and everyone's like, if you hit this right, if you get the next 10 steps right, you could be a unicorn. So like, let's figure out how to make sure the next 10 steps that you take are the right steps to take. And so it's just a totally different mentality. And I always say that as a startup founder, especially, I really love early stage. I'm really good at 0 to 1. I always say that like 1 to 100 isn't necessarily my skill set, but like put me in at 0 to 1 and that's where I really excel. Like if you're not willing to take out the trash at your office, no one else is going to. And in New York, that's a very, or at least it was back in like 2017, like a very foreign concept, right? And so by being in the Bay Area, being immersed with other founders that were working on interesting or maybe ideas that were thought of as being totally out there, you were able to just think in a different way and on a different level. So the things that you thought were maybe obtuse or prosaic, right? Like when you're out and surrounded by this amazing group of entrepreneurs, none of your ideas are prosaic. Like none of your ideas are obtuse, you know, and you get really honest feedback. And I think being part of that YC system, you really get this mentorship and support. And working with Sam was really awesome because he was really famous, but not as famous as he is now. But like, again, he just thinks in a different way and on a different level. And so we'd come back and say, hey, we grew this by 100x this week. And he'd be like, okay, go do 200. Like, I'm not interested. Give me more. Or he'd say like, you know, there's founders that are able to figure out how to work within and around regulation that are able to be successful and those that aren't and they fail. He's like, you have to pick who you want to be. And so just kind of like very honest, direct feedback in a way that also makes you think about the positioning for yourself. But I definitely freaked him out at one point in time. I remember I was so stressed out at one point. He told me I needed to go take like a walk. He's like, you need to go take a hike. Not like, he's like, you need to go take a hike. You need to go be out in nature. So I thought this shows the level of anxiety that can also exist in founders. If Sam Altman, who's been through it all, is telling you that you need to go hang out in nature for a couple of hours. But, you know, and also I think YC is a great brand. And so I think adding that credentialing and that credibility to your company, especially back in 2017, I mean, YC keeps on growing and expanding, which is incredible. You know, it is always helpful in opening doors as you're going out and seeking to try to get into a new client base or large financial institutions and kind of lending that stamp of approval.
It shows, I mean, I'm back to the take a hike thing. It shows how intense YC is. I mean, even for people as intense as you clearly are, and that's a compliment, and Sam clearly is as well. Even then, you have to sometimes, you know, just take a break and breathe. Did you said winter 2017 batch, correct?
Yeah.
So that's the batch of Brex, Fair, and Rippling. That's not too bad. And Retool as well.
Yeah, and Parker and Fair. Fair is another, or my friend, there's a bunch of unicorns that have come out of there. And we still have a very tight founder group. We named it Dumpster Fire because all startups are dumpster fires. And we still meet like a couple of times a month. So it's really amazing that the connections that we built we're still, you know, hanging out every 2 weeks.
I talk to so many YC founders, and on this show, I ask them what makes YC unique. What did they bring them? And there's a lot of answers, but one that really comes back almost every time is the community, the other founders that you meet, and the relationships that you build. And that's something that seems really unique. I've never been to YC myself, but maybe someday, maybe we'll go together. So
yeah, that's the next company for you, right? We need to get your fourth exit.
Exactly. You're right. So tell me about what's next. And we'll go back on the acquisition. We're not doing it chronologically. That's fine. But are you thinking of what's going next? And if you are, I want to ask you, are you bringing it back to YC?
Oh, I don't know if I'm bringing it back to YC. I think like I had a very good friend and collaborator who's a very seasoned entrepreneur. As I exited Arthena, kind of call me and be like, hey, what's up? What are you doing next? And I was like, well, you know, I don't know. It's been 3 weeks since the company sold. Like, not kidding. Like, I need a minute. And I ended up thinking it was a really great opportunity to join. And, now my co-founder, I've always thought really highly of as a person in business and an entrepreneur, and thought it would be an amazing opportunity to work with someone who is operating at a very high level. And so can't keep me away from AI. And so now we're doing in the most unsexy of industries. I went from art, which is like the coolest industry, to now doing AI pricing for insurance, which is very practical, but not necessarily
as sexy
as art. Yeah. But it's, I think picking your team is incredibly important. I think everyone who's been on this podcast probably knows that being a founder is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. And so you need to make sure that you're picking the right partner on that journey. My co-founder and I always joke that I talk to him more and he talks to me more than I talk to my husband and he talks to his wife, just because it's business.
Probably true.
And it's growing, right? And so, you're kind of, talking all day or working through things all day at all hours, because we're now servicing everywhere from the West Coast to Asia. And so, there's a lot of different time zones that we're covering with a relatively small team. But the cool thing about this one is that it's been self-funded. And so it's also really interesting to see what you can build. I shouldn't say it's bootstrapped, because bootstrapped would be the wrong term for what we've put into the company. I said we'd self-funded a seed round, but it's really cool to have that control in the beginning and be able to really see like what you can grow. And especially I think within something like insurance, it's a highly regulated market. And so there's a little bit more capital sometimes that you need up front to get those going. But it's been a really fun experience to see what does this look like without investors.
I guess I wanted to follow up with what's the thinking behind not going through YC, but you just explained it. You want to be the sole captain of your ship. And if you're able, I'm guessing with the exit, to sort of, be your own seed investor, that makes a lot of sense.
And I have 2 kids that are in school in New York City and are under 5. And I'm married to a colorectal surgeon who takes call every other night. And so I think that's the other thing, is I have to ship everyone out to the West Coast with me.
Yeah. That's the thing. Well, I mean, who knows? But you're, living in New York, I'm guessing made a lot of sense for art. And now you're not ready to move that soon with so many people to move with you. Yeah. But I'm sure you'll make it work. And tell me, so I'm surprised. I sort of asked you, what's next? And you told me there's something, but actually there's more than just something. You really started and had this sort of internal fundraise, etc. What's the timing like? So you said 3 weeks after the acquisition was too early, but it seems you've been very active and very busy. Did you take vacation?
No, I took 0 time off.
Didn't.
I think I have
That's crazy.
This. My therapist would say I have a fear of failure that's driven by fear of missing out. And basically, when an interesting opportunity presents itself, hypothetically, there's always more interesting opportunities, right? But like if there's something that's really interesting, it's like there's never a time like the present. And so I took a little bit more than 3 weeks. But, everything's been going successfully. We're generating like plus 6-figure MRR. And, we have almost upwards of, I guess you could say, 100 million in revolving capacity from insurers right now. And so it's been going really well. And again, like
Congrats.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's exciting, right? Like, I mean, you've done this like a couple of times now. I mean, like sometimes you're like, maybe can I only do this once? Is this my one shot? Will I ever get to do this again? And I think there's this like fear that sits inside, at least of me, of like, was this my one chance, right? Did I do this once and this was like my one home run? And so I think that like fear of failure definitely, and I know for a lot of my founder friends, it drives me, right? Of like, I have to like do this again, prove it to myself that I can do this again. And it's not about like, I don't know if it's for you, it's not about the financial incentive for me. It's about
Never is.
No, it's about the building component. It's like, I really like building things and I really like problem solving. And when I'm not doing that, I'm not as happy. And so, might as well keep building.
It's so interesting. So many people think it's all about the money, and almost everyone that is in a position of having exits and so having some, let's say, financial stability or heavier, bigger income, realizes that it's never about the money. Now, that being said, I mean, in the investing game, I do think money has its importance because it's about keeping score. A 10 million exit is not the same as $1 billion exit just because the score isn't the same.
Yeah.
And it's not for how much money is going to end up in your own bank account. It's just about the story it tells about yourself. So that's how I've been trying to reconcile the fact that I don't really want more money in my personal, daily life. But I actually do want more money just because it means I have a bigger impact I have a bigger score, I've succeeded more than before, something like this. I don't know if you think of it that way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Because I think it is like a scorecard. It is saying like, this is how successful I was. And the way that we judge this is by the dollar value that's assigned to this, right? So I think that does make sense. Like even like when you're fundraising or when you're bringing on capacity for an insurance product or you're building a fund, right? It's all a really clear benchmark of the success of that. So yeah, I think that definitely makes sense.
Okay, let's move on and go back to the exit. And so we went from the founding and then YC, and then we went to your new thing. But I was going to say the most exciting. It's not the most exciting, but a very exciting time was the exit as well. Just kind of walk us through the story. Did they reach out? What happened? And I know there's some things you can't say, but tell us what you can.
I would say that, the company reached a point where we were either going to raise a massive round and try to 10x what we had, or we were going to look for an exit. And the art and tech world is pretty small, as you can imagine. And Arthena was known for having the best pricing in the industry, hands down, right? We had built a reputation around that, probably because we were so fastidious with our engineering. That's actually something that drives me nuts. Like I wouldn't call it a micromanager because like I think micromanaging is the absolute wrong thing to do for your team. It takes the power away from your team. It doesn't empower the people that you're working with. It makes them second guess their work because they think you're second guessing your work. But I really like process, which I think is what I'm now driving my team crazy with now, is just like putting in place like a really clean process. But anyhow, we had great engineering process. We had a really beautiful product. We had really excellent pricing. We had different use cases that we were applying that pricing to internally from a B2B perspective. And they had reached out. And after they reached out, we're like, well, maybe this is something interesting. And then we ran a full M&A process, which is something that I had never done before, which is also really interesting. And I come from a long line of entrepreneurs, but they're now these multi-generational family businesses. So there's no sale, right? Like I've seen acquisitions, which is different, right? You're like, okay, so we need to go buy a staffing firm. Let's go buy a staffing firm versus, how do I sell my tech company and what does that look like? And so working with a full M&A process was something that was new. And I was really lucky enough to be able to rely on great expertise and especially investment banking and expertise that we had built support around us to help lead that process. And they ended up having the best offer. And so that's what we went with. And now I think Arthena has become the full data science arm for Masterworks and is empowering that data science arm for Masterworks.
You mentioned the best offer, and I had someone else on the pod talking about being acquired, so a YC founder who exited as well. And he said something that simple advice, just like often is the case with YC, but I thought really resonated with me is when you have an interested buyer and you're interested in selling, it's paramount that you have at least a second offer. And so he said you shouldn't, discover that when you get the first offer because it's too late. You should be nurturing those relationships in advance, et cetera. So you just talked about Masterworks and they reached out, but how did you manufacture or how did you come up with a second, maybe third offer? Were those only people who reached out all inbound, or did you go outside and sort of create them as well?
A lot of the other companies we had been working with as clients or were familiar with, and I should say when they reached out, they didn't say, hey, we want to buy you for X. They were like, hey, we heard that you might be interested in selling. And then I just ghosted them and didn't respond like I usually do. That's my toxic trait, is I forget to respond to emails because I get a lot of them and I never mean not to respond. I'm very bad at inbox management. Anyway, basically after we had this reach out, we then used the advice of an investment bank that we had been working with and then went around and started to put together, hey, we could be interested in selling, right? Would you be interested if we did sell in a potential acquisition? And if so, what's that offer? And basically just followed the advice of this investment bank we were working with in terms of running that process. And I would say that was incredibly helpful because, again, they do this every day and I had never done it before. So we really wanted that expertise.
No, that's super interesting. And you're in a position, luckily, and it's not luck, it's because you built something really cool, to have a bunch of people already interested in. So you just went back to them. And I wonder what it's like I wanted to ask you what it's like to go out and manufacture yourself those selling opportunities, but that's not the case, so we won't go there. Is there one thing that you learned from, throughout this whole acquisition process one, rely on investment bankers and professionals, I guess, but is there something else that you can share with us that you really remember that you're going to use in your next sale maybe or something?
It's not personal. I think I felt like I was giving up my first child, right? Like it was definitely the right decision in the right time. But I think it's still, there's like, I don't know if you felt like this, there's something incredibly emotional to selling your company, right?
Yep.
And it's like
the first one.
letting
Always.
go. Yeah, right? You're just like, oh, you've got to just let go and see if this can fly on its own. And I think that's just an incredibly hard thing to do. And I think that for a lot of founders, your identity is so tied to your company that unwrapping that is something that takes a little bit of time as well. And again, like, I think that's the first one versus the second one. I think I've learned a lot of those lessons and that, hey, you're not your company, right? Like they're two separate entities. There's you and there's your company and there's the value that you're providing to your company and founding your company and the expertise that you're bringing in, everything else as a founder. But I think like for a lot of founders, your identity is so wrapped up in what you've built that that's really hard to let go of. And it's also really weird to go from being like, I'm the CEO in charge of this team and like, you know, having all these really interesting conversations to all of a sudden like sitting on my couch because I sold my company and like, what do I do now? Which is probably why I jumped into something else so quickly.
No, it's so interesting what you mentioned about, you know, the difficulty of letting go. And you said it's like my first child, and it's something that I've lived personally. It's something that I've seen so many entrepreneurs go through. And I can tell you the second and third exits are much easier. The first time, it's insane. And I very often look back on my own, and I actually sold way too late. I didn't even want to realize that it was time for me to sell that business. And it's so interesting that so many people in our world, it's a bit of a philosophical segue, but I want to mention it. So many people, their identities is wrapped up into what they do. Even more when you're a CEO and entrepreneur, but also, you know, if you have a great career job as an employee, so many, and you see this at cocktail parties, the first question people ask is like, what do you do? And it's like, what do you do equals who you are. It's the only thing defining you. And so I've tried not to ask that question and not to talk about our jobs. And it's so interesting when you realize, including for myself, wait a minute, like I'm much more than a title and a role. Yes, I'm an entrepreneur. Yes, I'm an investor, but I'm, you know, a husband and dad, and I'm a guy passionate with X, Y, and Z. And I've read an interesting book last week and blah, blah, blah. And it's so rare. I mean, including in Silicon Valley where everyone has such huge ambitions, which is totally fine. We both have huge ambitions. I mean, for me, yes, for you, I'm sure. But you're not what you do. You are you, and what you do is parts of who you are.
It takes a lot of therapy to get to there. And what's really funny is like, I don't know if this happened for you, but like when I would try to explain to somebody what I did, like everyone just was like, that makes no sense to me. Like, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. And so for a long time, especially like my husband's a surgeon, when we'd go out to, or like my daughter's school where everyone's a banker or an attorney, you know, when we go out, when they would ask me what I would do, I'd just say, you know, not too much. So like, it was even like, in the beginning, I was like, it's like, I don't want to get into like sounding like a crazy person because I'm going to try to explain why ML and AI is important for pricing this like, you know, pretty obtuse asset class. And so instead of going into this conversation where everyone's eyes are going to glass over, I'm just going to say, hey, like, you know what, you know, not too much, you know, hang out with the kids.
You sounded like the perfect housewife, which you are not. Not that it's a bad thing. I just, you know, don't make me say anything that I haven't. But yeah, it's interesting. I've heard that before. Someone who was having a job sort of difficult to explain, consulting for CEOs and whatever. And he would go to cocktail parties and he would say, hey, I'm a plumber. And that's it. People don't ask you any follow-up questions like, okay, you're a plumber. That's fine. Anyway, you know, we sadly have to wrap up, but thank you so much for your time. Before we leave, I want to ask you 3 very easy questions. 1, can you share what you're excited about in your new venture? You've told us what it is. What gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you really excited, except that the business is going well, but what's coming, what's new to this quote unquote boring business? I'm sure there's a lot of exciting stuff, so please share.
Yeah, it's called the Barker Price, and we named it Barker because I don't know if you watched The Price is Right. It was a joke, Bob Barker. It's an American game show that they play in the afternoon.
No,
right? Where,
I know of it, of course.
So Bob Barker would always be like, the price is right. And so we were joking, we're like, great. So our price is always going to be accurate because we're using quant to price it. And then when we were trying to come up with an actual name for it, we're like, wait a second, this is actually catchy. Why don't we just keep it? And then
that's pretty cool. Pretty fun.
the
Okay, that
Barker
makes perfect
price,
sense.
and we're warrantying our valuations, and we're using insurance capacity and Lloyd's to do that. And so we're valuing assets for financial applications, insurance applications, lending applications, and then we actually warranty that valuation. Because what's really funny is what gets me up in the morning is I love solving hard problems that seems like not a lot of other people want to solve. And I like lumpy, disparate, and sparse data. And I feel like Sherlock Holmes when I'm going through a bunch of really messy data sets or trying to figure out how to aggregate mass amounts of data. And you're like finding these different featurizations that aren't working or like the different nomenclatures that don't match up. I'm like, I got it, which is probably the nerdiest thing I'll say this week. But
It's cool. I love it.
I love it. And so like that gets me up in the morning. And actually when things are all burning down, I also really enjoy it. So if we're in like a stressful or emergency situation or something's broken or we're trying to service a client, like I live for that because I love going. I feel like I would have been a good sea captain in like the 18th century. Like I really like being in stressful situations, which we're not in a lot of, unfortunately. For me, fortunate for our customers and the rest of our team. But that's what I really enjoy is the complexity, the feeling like you're solving something that's interesting and difficult, and then the aha moment when you solve that thing or solve that problem or kind of reach a plateau. That's what I really love to do. And then, I don't know, we'll see what happens next.
No, that's brilliant. I absolutely love it. And, don't worry, after this startup, you can still, build a ship and go sail and meet pirates or something. Who knows? Then I'll get you to do a second episode on the pod and talk about what you discovered at sea. But no, that's really, really awesome. The second thing I want to ask you, is there a book or a quote that had a significant impact on your life that you keep going back to that you could share with us?
Oh my God, that's really tough because I love, I don't know, everyone loves Shakespeare, or at least they say they love Shakespeare, but I don't know.
Not on the tech pod, so you're the first. Go ahead.
All's well that ends well. How about that? And then I think as a leader, I really loved reading Shackleton's Way. The director of the MIT Museum gave it to me back in graduate school. And I don't know if you know about Shackleton and the journey to the Northwest Passage, but again, talking about sea captains, basically, they were stranded, their ship was frozen, and he got the whole team home safely, right? He got the whole team home alive. It's excellent. It's short. It's a short read. It's fun. But basically what he did is he recognized, instead of trying to unify everybody and be like, this is the way or the highway, this is what we're doing, he understood what motivated each individual team member. And he then helped motivate each individual team member the way that they needed to be motivated in order to get them to do what he wanted them to do and ultimately get the result that he wanted to achieve, which was getting his whole team home safely. And I think as a leader, sometimes you see leaders that are it's my way or the highway. This is the way we're doing it. If you're not doing it this way, you can leave. But I don't always think that makes the best teams. I think that diversity of thought is incredibly important in an organization. And if you want diversity of thought and diversity of process, then you can't expect everybody to operate the same way. And so I think that was, when I read it when I was, 22, I remember just logging it.
Last year.
Last year. Yeah, exactly. Last year. But, I think, and I frequently give out copies of that just because I think there's, something to that. And it's an old tale.
I'll absolutely add it to my list. I'll absolutely read it. And I was listening to you and thinking, you haven't gifted it to Sam Altman, have you? Because he probably needs to read it, doesn't he?
I'm not saying anything about Sam. I think he's he's great. He's absolutely great. Thank you for letting me into YC. I really appreciate it. Love you, man.
You're doing okay. That's fine. Very last thing. Where can people reach you if they want to learn more, either about Arthena is what I was looking for, or the barter price? Where can they reach you if they want to learn more?
So you can reach me at Madeleine at the Barker Price with my funny spelling that I'm sure will be in the podcast subtitle.
Yep.
Or on LinkedIn, which, by the way, I'm also the worst LinkedIn user. It's I hate the masturbatory effect of LinkedIn where everyone's like, hey, look at this cool thing that I just did. And look at this cool thing that I just did. And I'm like, we all know that your life's a disaster. It's cool. Yeah. We're all a disaster.
Social media.
I know. I'm not a good social media user. I'm just not. But I feel like I probably should get into LinkedIn more now that I have a new company.
You should. You just get someone to do it for you. It's a useful It's a useful, terrible tool, but it's useful.
Yeah. I mean, people love seeing what other people are up to. Whether it's altruistic or for interest or because you believe in Schadenfreude, people like to see what other people are up to. So that makes sense.
Yeah, it is what it is. Madeleine, it's been brilliant chatting with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
It was awesome. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Lobster Talks. Don't forget to subscribe, of course, and for more conversations like this. And please leave us a comment or a review on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and remember, those big ideas start somewhere.